Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just want to say that I'm honored to welcome each and every one of you to today's distinguished webinar on a critical and pressing subject, which is PFAS and the AFFF litigation. We have the privilege of hosting several esteemed legal minds from Napoli-Skolnick who have devoted their careers to navigating the complexities of this challenging legal landscape. In the legal world, Napoli-Skolnick is one of the most recognized top litigating firms in our mass tort space. Their names are synonymous with expertise, dedication, particularly when it comes to environmental litigation. So today, they join us to shed light on the latest developments in this mass tort, an area of law that has a far-reaching implications for individuals, communities, and industries alike. First, I would just like to welcome and introduce everybody on the call. Hunter Skolnick, which is one of the managing partners at Napoli-Skolnick, Andrew Krona, who is a partner at Napoli-Skolnick, and Nicholas Mendocino, who is an associate at Napoli-Skolnick. Hunter is, as I mentioned, the managing partner at Napoli-Skolnick. He is a well-respected and dedicated attorney who focuses on the trials of significant personal injury cases, primarily in the area of environmental, drug, automobile, aviation, and product liability litigation. As an esteemed attorney, he leads the discovery and the trial teams of various mass tort pharmaceutical and medical device litigations to the firm. He is also an active managing national litigation and plaintiff litigation groups that he manages. So thank you for joining us, Hunter.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Andrew Krona is a partner at Napoli-Skolnick. He heads the firm's environmental department. His practice focuses on representing clients who have been harmed by environmental contaminants, including both public and private water supplies. Andrew currently represents hundreds of clients in the lawsuit filed against the manufacturers of AFFF, a fire suppression agent used for decades by the military and civilian airports and fire departments that has contaminated our water systems across the country with these toxic forever chemicals. So thank you very much for joining us, Andrew. And Nicholas Mendocino is an associate at Napoli-Skolnick in their environmental litigation department. Prior to joining Napoli-Skolnick, Nicholas engaged in complex litigation in many different fields. Nicholas has now joined the firm's environmental litigation team, where he uses his litigation skills to hold accountable those who have harmed others through careless use of these toxic materials. So I just want to give a little 2-minute, not even, just an update of exactly what these chemicals are and how they're poisoning us. Water poisoning is one of the most pressing environmental contamination issues of our time. These forever chemicals are one of the most dangerous chemicals known to science today. The human body cannot tolerate even a trace amounts of this substance. PFOA, PFOS poisoning could cause cancer, liver disease, reproductive problems, and a host of other injuries. Frequently, evidence of these illnesses do not appear for years or sometimes even decades. Even though the statute of limitations in these cases are normally 2 years, these victims still have legal options, thanks to the discovery rule. Victims are not obligated to file claims until they realize the full extent of their injuries, and they connect those injuries with another person's or entity's wrongful conduct. So with that, I just have a few questions, and we'll do a little Q&A. And also, everyone, if anyone else has questions, there is a Q&A section. Please put your questions in, and we'll do our best to get to them. Let me just introduce myself for anyone that does not know who I am. My name is Paul Liebman. I am the Chief Revenue Officer for X Social Media. X Social is one of the premier marketing firms and largest marketing firms in the entire legal vertical. And Hunter is back. So with that, I think let's jump right in.
Good afternoon, everyone. As many of you thought This presentation was supposed to be featuring my partner, Paul Napoli, who's co-lead in the AFFF MDL, along with Mike London and Scott Summey. They have been spearheading this case for the last 4.5 years now. And very often when you hear the words AFFF or PFOS, they're usually being used interchangeably. But as we go on, you're going to hear how they're related and how they're not exactly the same. But usually when we're talking about the litigation, PFOS, PFAS, and AFFF, there's a direct relationship. As many of you have heard, in that MDL, there has already been, in the last few months, in excess of $14.5 billion of settlements on behalf of water districts across the United States, small and large water districts. Those settlements, contrary to popular belief, do not apply to personal injury cases. They are directly focused and only relate to water suppliers, your water districts, so that they can clean up the water supply and try to get the PFAS, PFOS out of our water. But that's just one piece of that MDL. The case is still proceeding on behalf of water districts as well against various other defendants than the two that settled. But the next major phase of the case is, I think we're going to be spending a little bit more time about today, deals with the personal injury side of PFAS or AFFF litigation. There are multiple levels of litigation involving these chemicals because it's affecting everything. It's not just health effects, the personal injuries. It's the cleanup of our water, cleanup of our ground contamination, and the like. So first, let me talk about the chemicals themselves. PFAS has been around since about the 1940s. They were manufactured chemicals that have been used in industry and various consumer products since that time. Because of their widespread use and their persistence in the environment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The important thing is their persistence in the environment, that many of these PFAS chemicals are found in the blood of a lot of people. They're found in animals all over the world. And what you're finding out is that these chemicals are in so many different products that we're using on any given day. And not just the water we're drinking, and this problem is multi-dimensional. Not only do we have to clean up our water, but we have to stop using it in products. We have to stop relying on it so that we could cut back its continuous injection into our water supply and into our bodies. Are PFAS safe? Bottom line answer is no, they're not safe. Research is ongoing and has been, every day we're seeing new articles. But research has shown that PFAS, the chemical, can lead to various health effects. There are various studies. There was the litigation involving C8. That was a litigation up in Ohio involving a factory release. And in that case, they did a science panel, something that usually is sought after by defendants, but not and usually end up with a resounding defense for defendants. Anytime I've heard of them being used in litigation historically, it's been a get out of jail free card for the defendant. And I think that's what they thought was going to happen in the C8 litigation, also referred to as the Leach case. Shocking to the defendants in that case, the Leach scientific study revealed that the PFAS has a scientifically reliable, a Dalbert withstandable series of injuries tied to these chemicals. One is cancer, one is increased cholesterol levels and weight effect on the body's immune system, inability to fight infections, developmental defects such as low birth weight, and behavioral changes, and reproductive effects. I'm not suggesting that you want to sign up cases for all those different injuries. The level of strength of the science is really, it goes the full gamut from strong to very mild. I would say most of us would be focusing on the cancer cases related to the PFA substances, and those are primarily the kidney and testicular cancers, prostate cancers, and the like. So what are PFAS? Like, what is PFAS? What is PFOS? These are synthetic chemicals. I'm not going to get too much into my science speeches here, but they're synthetic chemicals. They have multiple fluorine atoms. They're attached to alkyl chains. The ones we're most focused upon are the ones that have 8 carbon links or 8 carbon chains. So there may be, I'm not even sure how many. I think maybe Andrew or Nick may be able to tell you better, but there's probably 100 different types of per and polyfluoral alkyl substances, PFAS substances out there, but we're primarily focusing on the PFOS, the 8 carbon chain molecules. Why did these chemicals get used so extensively? Well, they have very unique properties. Number one property, they impart oil and water repellency. They are water repellent. Very important. They are temperature resistant, and they are friction reduction. They're slippery. They're good. They're good if there's a fire. They will encompass the fire, not allow oxygen into the fire. So it was a natural use for firefighting substances. It was also a natural use for such things as coating pots, Teflon. Every one of us, think about, when you're growing up, all the Teflon pots, the Teflon commercials, every one of those pots after years start having the scrapes in them. And everyone's always saying, don't scratch your Teflon pots. Well, when you're scratching your Teflon pots, you're releasing the PFOA into the food you're cooking. Where else were they used? Fabric protection. Scotchgard. I don't know how old everyone in the audience is, but those of us remember Scotchgard commercials. Everything had little signs. We have Scotchgard, our carpet, our furniture, our drapes in the house, you name it. If it's Scotchgard, it doesn't stain. Again, it's that the PFOA or PFAS properties that are so important. And they're also used in such things as the wrappers when you buy your fast food, those nice slippery packages where none of the hamburger cheese is sticking and it's easily sliding in and sliding out. So we were using these chemicals consistently in our everyday life. But more importantly, what we started to see is that it was best used and it was most highly used as a firefighting component or a chemical in firefighting foam. So when we talk about the AFFF litigation, yes, we're talking PFAS. Yes, we're talking PFOS or PFOA. But we're looking at the actual use. It would be like saying this is the Scotchgard litigation. The AFFF is the use of the product. And it's really, we've all seen pictures of it. Hopefully we've never actually seen it being used, because it usually means there's some type of aviation fire or oil related fire or fuel related fire, because you use the foam to control the fire. Luckily, AFFF, the firefighting foam or aqueous film forming foam, number one, it's effective in extinguishing flammable liquids, and its key ingredient is PFOA. This has been used wherever there's airplane fires. Though we don't see a lot of airplane crashes, and we don't see that many fires where it's actually being used. But in order to become adept at using it, they must practice with it all the time. So if those of you who travel extensively in this business like myself, and you're in and out of airports all the time, it's not uncommon to see a mock-up burn pit at the end of runways in various airports. What they do is every day or every few days, they take the crews out and they practice putting out fires on airplanes. And what they would do is they would use thousands of gallons of firefighting foam to put out these make-believe fires. Well, for decades, no one thought about, well, what's going to happen? What happens when this foam washes off the runways? Where does it go? Well, it ended up in our water systems. Since the into the 1970s, the military use has been, actually, since the 70s, the Department of Defense has been using AFFF and formulations containing PFAS and PFOA, chemicals manufactured by companies like 3M, as well as DuPont, in their firefighting foam. And so when you see them using thousands of gallons of it, they were not being warned of the cancer-causing nature of the chemical, and they were just allowing it to pour off the runways into the water supply. So that's the heart of the AFFF litigation, and what I would refer to as the PFAS or PFOA litigation that we're all looking at today. Well, why do we care so much about it's being poured off the runways? I don't live near an airport. Well, many of our communities are adjacent to or have airports near their water supplies. So if the aquifer is running under the airport or under a military base where tens of thousands of gallons of this material is used on any given week, slowly but surely it ends up in the water supply. And you may not live near that airport, you may not live near that military base or that close to it, but if it's getting into the water supply from that air base or that military base, it's contaminating the water in your community. What's important is there's been a phase out of PFAS starting in 2003. Around that time, 3M stopped producing it. They knew at that time that they should stop manufacturing it and stop producing it to the makers of the foam. They may not make the foam. They sold it to the foams being made by companies such as Kitty and the like. Approximately 75% of the Department of Defense PFOA had been manufactured by 3M, give or take. And 3M is the company that settled the Water District case so far. They're still involved in the personal injury and the cleanup cases. By 2016, the Department of Defense restricted use of PFOA in PFOS-based AFFF, the aqueous firefighting foam, and they started testing their bases. It was around 2016. At that time, a report released that about 401 bases across the country were known or had suspected PFAS release. 90 bases had groundwater contaminated in excess of 70 parts per trillion. It's an important number, 70 parts per trillion. At that time, 36 bases had drinking water concentrations in excess of 70. Well, today, it's not 70 parts per trillion. We're talking, if I'm not mistaken, 4 parts per trillion. It is a speck compared to what they were looking at before. So what we're finding out is that what was considered a high contamination at 70 by today's standard, that is just that's so out of control high. Today, it's as low as 4 parts per trillion. And we're finding that in our water supplies across the country. 2018, the Department of Defense began converting AFFF to what we call the short chain PFAS, or low bioaccumulation risk, and other PFAS-free alternatives. Clearly, by 2018, the cat was out of the bag. Everyone knows this stuff was bad. They were using it for decades. It has contaminated water among most of the water supplies around military bases and airports around the country.
Thank you for that, Hunter.
I'm sorry. I'm still. I just lost my selection. I'm so, my point. So now I want to just focus a little bit now here on, they phase it out. What's very important is the PFAS is resistant to degradation. That means it persists in the environment. It stays. It's a forever chemical. That's another phrase you're going to hear about PFAS and AFFF. It's there. It doesn't go away. It's detectable in most Americans. There's occupational exposures, this is very important for what you're all looking for today in terms of getting cases. Occupational exposures, people who produce PFAS, firefighters, people use it on any given day. There's also the consumption of it from contaminated water and food. The food supply is contaminated. We represent farmers that have had to destroy, thousands of heads of cattle and destroyed crops because the water from a military base proved contaminated. They tested the farm, they tested the animals, everybody was contaminated. So they had to destroy everything. It's used in airports, military facilities, and now it's in all of our water supplies. And now at this point, I think I turn it over to Andrew and Nick, because you have a series of questions you'd like to cover, and I went longer than I think I was supposed to.
Thank you, Hunter. That was great. Andrew?
Are there questions that we're
Sure.
planning to answer, or other? Okay.
Paul, you had the questions you wanted to pose?
Yep, absolutely. Let's start. Is there any specific geographic locations that may be better than others at this point for PFAS nationwide? Are there any areas?
Well, I think as Hunter mentioned, and while this focuses more on AFFF than broader PFAS, say in consumer products, a lot of the personal injury cases that have been filed thus far in the AFFF MDL have focused on communities that are nearby military bases, communities that are nearby airports, and in particular, what they call Part 139 certified airports, which are the bigger airports that are governed by the FAA, who actually mandated beginning in 1988 that airports stock AFFF and train with it. And then in 2004, they actually went a step further and said that the AFFF needed to meet the military specifications. And it's only been in recent years that FAA has sort of eased and started a formal transition process to get away from AFFF. But yes, airports is communities located by airports, communities near, obviously fire departments use this, but as Hunter mentioned, there's not as many live fires. The vast majority of the contamination from AFFF resulting from AFFF use is not use on live fires, but really use in training. And so there are some communities that have specific fire training centers. We represent a number of water districts. We also represent individuals on Long Island where you have 70 different fire departments that use one training center, and the surrounding communities, their water is contaminated because up until recently there was no guidance saying not to train with AFFF. Now training foam has been developed, which sort of simulates what it's like to use and dispense AFFF without the PFAS being in it. But up until at least the mid 1990s, there really was no such thing, and there was no guidance saying you shouldn't be out there training with this stuff. And obviously, the way that AFFF waste, which is after you put out, whether it's a live fire or a training fire, the wastewater that's left over, how that's disposed of today is far different than it was, going back to the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. So I think, as far as AFFF is concerned, there are definitely focuses based on geography around those types of facilities. As far as the broader PFAS and consumer products, I have not seen that, there's been particular focuses on different communities. I guess the one other geographic area of focus is manufacturing facilities. So, if we have anybody in the audience from North Carolina, they may be familiar with the Fayetteville, Chemours facility that is responsible for a large amount of contamination along the Cape Fear River. That's really what prompted the C8 litigation that Hunter mentioned earlier, which is right on the border of Ohio and West Virginia on the Ohio River. So you have seen some personal injury, consolidated actions focus on geographic areas around manufacturing facilities. But outside of that, as far as consumer products are concerned, because they're distributed really many of them across the country, you're not seeing as much of a geographic focus.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, we actually use geo-targeting to find those.
Paul, if I could just add one point to there. What we have seen is that there are maps that show from the Department of Defense that show where they have tested military bases around the country. Those maps are pretty much designated as what I would call hot zones, in the sense that we know from testing, extensive testing, that it was, number one, used. There's records of its use, and then the government went and it was nice enough to do the testing there. We know it hit the water supply at the base, and if it made it into the aquifers, chances are it's in the community. And we're representing people out in Colorado Springs. There was I think it's a military base out there.
U.S. Air Force.
There, the aquifer, if I'm not mistaken, is 60 feet below the surface. In New York, where we're talking about that one fire training center, it's hundreds of feet, maybe 500 feet down. It takes a lot longer for that to get into the water supply. But when you're in a place like Colorado Springs, 60 feet, it was pouring right in, and it went over a vast community. There's thousands of people that have been retained for that.
Well, so one question: two of the main, obviously, illnesses are testicular and kidney cancer. How could you confirm PFAS or fire foam is responsible for those types of cancers? How do you put the two together?
Well, Nick, you want to
I think,
or Andrew?
Yeah, I think partially, again, some of it is the geographic proximity. I think when we go into, our personal injury cases, we focus on, in that given area, what are the potential sources that are out there. And, if you're nearby an airport or a military, installation, that's really going to be a strong indicator that it's probably AFFF. Now, we have other cases where, it may be industrial sources, because these PFAS chemicals were used, as intermediates in a number of manufacturing processes as well. So, it really does, it does depend a bit on where the person is exposed and how they were exposed. As I think Hunter mentioned, a lot of the focus now and a lot of the research in the medical community has up to this point focused on drinking water and exposure through that. But we're starting to see the science develop a bit more on other types of exposure, whether it's firefighters who used AFFF, even the protective clothing, what they call turnout gear, that were used by firefighters contain PFAS, and there's science developing about whether that expose the firefighters to these harmful chemicals and can lead to health effects as well.
So
Paul, if I could, Nick, can you talk about how we also establish it through testing? I think you're doing a lot of that work in the bellwether space right now.
Sure. We, for our firm, at least, and different firm might have different approaches, but we think the blood testing is important, and knowing what the level in the blood is important. To go to a more basic level, no oncologist in the country is going to tell you this person's cancer was caused by this. There's just no way to tell. The person has cancer, what their risk factors are, and then what were those risk factors compared to what they had. So now PFAS exposure is a big risk factor. The higher the exposure, the more risk factor there is. Higher level in your blood means more risk factor. And then you have to weigh that against other risk factors they might have. So a plaintiff that has family history of cancer might have a harder time proving a link than someone who doesn't.
How about smoking? How about a heavy smoker?
Yeah, right. So it's a differential diagnosis. It's a matter of, is there other factors that outweigh this one, or can this one be shown to be such a predominant factor that it can be the cause?
So Nick, I have a question. So is the level of PFAS in the blood from these blood tests that you're taking, right? You actually probably try to track it back to that heat map that Hunter was talking about earlier, right?
Yes, yes and no. It's definitely helpful if we can.
Does a higher level of PFAS in those tests mean that the plaintiff may have a stronger case?
So I would say, and I was going to try to make this point that
That
it's sort of
depends.
it depends on when you think the exposure is, because if somebody was exposed, 20 years ago, was diagnosed with, a condition, and that condition is now being shown to be linked to PFAS, they may have a lower level, but there are experts out there that can do modeling, that can, take whatever that blood test result is and do their calculations to show what it would have been at more near to the time of exposure, and use that to help establish that it was really the PFAS that was, responsible for the health effect. If it's somebody that was exposed very recently and they have sky high levels, yeah, that's a great case. But there are ways to sort of get past, the lower blood levels for past exposure because of those experts and some of the models that they've developed.
But also, isn't there also, and Andrew, it's something important for everyone to understand, a very high level today and a diagnosis today may not be enough to prove your case, because if the person never lived in an exposed area for the years before and they just happen to move into a hot zone and happen to be diagnosed today, so it's not, everything is not a one-to-one correlation. You have to look at the whole person. Was the person a 40-year pack smoker, didn't live in a PFAS area, moves to a PFAS neighborhood, develops kidney or testicular cancer and a high blood level? Is it the water for 6 months or a year, or is it the 40-pack year smoker? So these are things that everyone has to keep in mind when you're signing up these cases. Don't assume everybody, just because they have a little bit in their blood and everyone has a diagnosis somewhere, is a PFAS or AFFF case, because it's not that easy. It's gotten a lot easier than when we were younger lawyers, when we wouldn't touch these cases. But there's a lot of science to this and a lot of finessing. And what could look like at first blush a good case may turn out to be an extremely bad one when you start looking at those medical records and find out they worked in an industrial site, a benzene plant, smoked, while they were using the benzene. I mean, all joking aside, you have to look at the whole plaintiff.
All right.
And just add to it, sometimes your blood level can go down by certain things. There's some studies that kidney dialysis machines will cause you to reduce it. Blood transfusions might reduce your levels a little bit. There's not a lot of science on that stuff, but low levels don't tell you the whole picture either.
Got it. Let's sort of pivot a little bit, and let's talk about the MDLs for both fire foam and for PFAS.
One MDL.
One MDL, my apologies.
One MDL.
Can we talk about that MDL and sort of where we are, what's going on with it?
I'll leave that to Andrew and Nick. They're on the ground day to day.
Sure. And one thing I'll say, because there are questions about whether there's a PFAS MDL, when the AFFF MDL was first created, there were, some parties involved that were pressing the idea of creating a broader PFAS MDL, and the JPML rejected that approach. And I think what you're seeing, if you're looking more broadly, is there are litigations that are starting to coalesce around certain types of products. I know that there's litigation about McDonald's food wrapping, and so that's the way you're starting to see it. But I would be surprised if you got sort of a broader PFAS MDL, non-AFFF PFAS MDL, just given the JPML and how they dealt with it before. But as far as the status of where we are in the AFFF MDL, that was created, at the I believe it was the end of 2018, and so we have done a lot, and during COVID, a lot of general liability discovery of the various manufacturer defendants. There was a bellwether.
If I don't mean to interrupt you, how many defendants are we talking? How many manufacturers?
So
'Cause we all hear 3M and DuPont, but
yeah, it's about 20, and they break down into three groups because I think most people have named all parts of the supply chain essentially. You have the AFFF manufacturers, your 3M, your Tyco ChemGuard, National Foam, Kidde, Amerex, Buckeye. I think that's pretty much that group. But then most of them got the fluorosurfactants, which is the PFAS, that was the primary active ingredient that gives the fire foam its properties. They got it from another company, and those companies were Ciba-Geigy, Dynex, DuPont. Eventually, in the early 2000s, as 3M was exiting the market, they decided to really kind of double down on fire foam and become a fluorosurfactant manufacturer. And then there's other companies that make the raw materials that go into the fluorosurfactants. And DuPont has been in that market, since the 70s. But then you also have companies, Clariant Corporation, AGC, which is Asahi Glass Company, which is a Japanese company that has sold the raw materials here in the U.S. Daikin's another one. So you do have a pretty big group of manufacturer defendants, but they straddle sort of three product markets within the AFFF space. Well, sorry, if I could just add one thing. What I will say is, as Hunter mentioned, in the AFFF MDL, the biggest player is by far 3M. I think that's reflected in the two settlements that you've seen so far. And part of that is because two things. One, they were completely vertically integrated. They didn't get any materials from anybody. They made the raw materials, they made the fluorosurfactants, and they made the foam. They did phase it out in the early 2000s, but they were the dominant market player. And their firefighting foam used PFOS. They're the only manufacturer that used PFOS. So when it comes to identifying, who is responsible for the AFFF that was used and contaminated, it's a lot easier to, point the finger at 3M than some of these other defendants, because we know if we see PFOS in the testing, that's 3M.
3M. So I just have a question, and then we'll sort of go back to, I think, what everyone else cares about. But with 3M, right, and obviously with 3M earplugs and all the environmental issues and everything else, I'm sure people are worried about what their balance sheet looks like, cash on hand, and etc. Do you know if there are insurance policies that should sort of protect 3M? Or do you think, what do you think their exposure is and what they can handle?
let me address that. We really can't go into their financials that have been shared with us, their insurance. Let's be realistic. This is potentially one of the biggest contamination products in the world. I'm not saying United States. I'm not saying segments of the United States. It is unreasonable for people to think that there is enough insurance or cash on hand in a balance sheet to cover all of these problems. There has to be some realistic understanding that in litigation, you got to do your best. Otherwise, we're going to be sharing pennies in bankruptcy. Right now, I'm actually missing a conference call on it, but I'm on the co-chair of one of the bankruptcy committees involving Kidde. This is a smaller player than 3M, but a big player. But they saw the writing on the wall. They filed for bankruptcy to protect whatever they have. This is a real problem, and that's why if you're going to pick cases, pick good ones. Don't just fill up an inventory with a lot of little cases thinking you're going to get, we'll squeeze a few thousand here, 5,000 there. Think long and hard about the cases you sign up. There's good ones out there. Also, there's there is, in the MDL, and I don't mean to step on Andrew for what he was talking about, but you also have the fire gear case as part of the AFFF. For whatever reason, that was lumped into the AFFF litigation. And this is addressing a question I think that was posed by someone in the audience. State court, I love suing in state court. I'm the guy who tried a 7-month state court opioid trial during COVID. So I'll go to state court any day of the week. I wish I could. These cases are getting removed, whether it's government contractor, whether it's federal question. I'm not the one focusing on that issue, but they're ending up in the MDL, and there is a track now in the MDL for the firefighters, whether they're military, whether they're private, or whether they were volunteer. If your claim is that you got it from your gear, you're in the MDL. And I mean, I just wanted to address that one question. Sorry to deviate.
Oh, that's okay. So let me ask you this, between AFFF and PFAS, do you think the AFFF will settle first? Is that your...
Well, AFFF PFAS is the chemical in AFFF. Actually, as Andrew said, 3M product is PFOA. I think Nick and Andrew could explain it better than I. The other manufacturers are a different PFAS, but what they do is they break down to PFOA. So you're talking, it's like saying I'm eating a Big Mac or I'm eating a hamburger. It's a hamburger, but it's a Big Mac, but inside it is a hamburger. So what's inside it is the chemical.
Yeah, to put it into mass tort terms, it's AFFF is cigarettes. PFAS is the nicotine.
There you go. He's smarter than I am. Got to go to the young guys.
Very good analogy.
I like McDonald's better. I don't smoke.
So, all right. Let me ask just a couple of more questions. From the documents that actually I've seen, this problem started back in the 60s. Is that your understanding as well?
I would pin it, not to say that there may not have been signs in the 60s. I think the 70s and the 80s are frankly the critical period. You see in, in the 70s, 3M is doing its own, its own work studying some of the health effects, not necessarily on humans, but in animals, and they're starting to see some signals. There is and look, some of this, if you look online, the state of Minnesota has published its exhibit list against 3M. You can see a lot of these documents. A lot of what obviously we've learned a lot more in the context of the MDL under a protective order, but a lot of this stuff is actually publicly available. So you see 3M doing these animal studies where they're getting some of the safety signals. They're not sharing it with anybody. Then you're also seeing in the mid 70s that 3M is learning that PFOS is already in the blood of the general population, and they're not sharing that either. It was one thing when it was their factory workers. Once you sort of get past that, and you're seeing people that are just walking the street, have no connection to AFFF or the manufacturing facility, and they have this stuff in their blood. That's a huge problem. That means it's getting out in the environment. It's spreading, and again, it's not until the late, I believe, 1998 they submitted some a lot of documentation on these risks to the EPA, and that led to ultimately to the phase out that Hunter mentioned in 2000. So yeah, I do think while there may have been some signs in the 60s, it's really the 70s and then into the 80s that and then things start to shift a little bit in the 90s, where I think people were starting to recognize the environmental effects. And that's why you're starting to see people not train with it as much anymore. You're starting to see some guidance on that. And then as you move into 2000s, that's when, when EPA finally gets this information from 3M and it's starting to get it from DuPont, that's when they realize, oh man, this is potentially causing health effects in humans, and we've got a real problem here.
Let me ask you this. So, do you have any idea how many of us in this country are affected, have it in our blood of level?
Have it in their blood.
Say again?
98. There have been studies that indicate that 98% of the population have PFAS in their blood. That if you tested everybody's blood, 98% will come back with some level of PFAS in it.
Of the level that it's unacceptable or unhealthy, do you have any idea what that looks like in the breakdown?
That, frankly, I think
there's no safe level according to the EPA, just to be clear. The EPA says there is no safe level of exposure.
So let me ask one other question. Since this has been going on so long and we call it the forever chemicals and everything else, do you think that this is going to turn into another type of asbestos type of situation where it's going to last forever? Or do you think it's going to be resolved and that's going to be the end of the litigation?
You know, that's crystal ball stuff. There's a lot more manufacturers of asbestos than there are of PFAS, PFOA related to these, to this contamination. And I think the big warning here is be careful. Too big, there's no such thing as too big to fail in this business. Litigation can become too big, and the whole litigation can fail on us. So it will go on for a long time. We're moving into the bellwether process now for personal injury cases. I think the trial is 2024, Andrew and Nick.
Yeah,
is
it's
scheduled.
not a set date, but that's the goal.
And then there's also pursuing the cases against the non-3M DuPont manufacturers for the water districts. That's going to be another phase of the litigation we're going into right now. I think we refer to them as the telemer, many of the telemer products, or the ones that break down. So there are more defendants to go. It's going to go on for years. But I don't know. I mean, is the damage potentially asbestos-like? Yeah.
It is.
Potential.
And I think there may be some tail to this litigation also, just as far as, the science on this is still developing. And you're starting to see, as Hunter mentioned, 2012, you had the science panel. There's links established between PFOA and certain injuries, but you're starting to see more and more different types of cancers that are getting, linked to PFAS exposure. And so, I think that that's another reason why some of the litigation will continue, because, we're still, I think, in the early stages of the scientific community really taking a look at a lot of these issues, because it's only recently that anybody found out about it. So,
I mean, just today, I watched a presentation by a researcher that looked at testicular cancer in the military. And I mean, these studies are happening as we speak. It was just released today, where they actually took a controlled environment of Air Force, Air Force members, some who they knew were exposed, some who were not, and it showed a pretty direct correlation between the elevation of PFAS in the water in these bases. So we're learning a lot. We know injuries that are there. We know the testicular cancer, the kidney cancers and the like. Who knows what they're going to find down the road?
Could you share, if you're able to, considering where you are in litigation, Hunter, or any, Andrew or Nicholas, any insights that you may give us on the litigation, sort of how it's going, what the defense may be thinking, that type of thing, and then we can get into how they can contact, you guys to talk.
Let me give you how the defense are thinking. They did nothing wrong. We're making this all up, and no one is sick from their product. I could take that defense to every one of our environmental cases. I think they're scared. In reality, I think when you get into the board of these companies, they know this is bet the company litigation. When I was a younger lawyer, we thought $100 million cases were a lot. These are tens of billions of dollars, the exposure that these companies have. They don't have the wherewithal to pay all this. Their insurance companies are not going to cover all this. It's a real problem. So it's the defenses are, number one, you didn't get in the personal injury area. You can't prove it was my product that caused your disease. You may have it, a ubiquitous level in your blood. How do you know it wasn't from the Teflon pan that mom made your eggs every morning when you were a kid. That's going to be like in every case. What is the specific causation? That's the big problem. Smokers, work industrial, work in any other type of exposure, lived in places that have other, have a disposal site nearby that everything is in the dump. So that's the defenses we're going to see. Someone asked a question. Let me ask quick before Andrew jumps in.
Sure.
Turnout gear injuries, they're not different injuries. They're the same ones. They're the bladder cancers, testicular cancer, and the like. It's not skin cancer. And your question does make me think about the relationship with how do you get it from a rubberized coat. That's going to be an issue that those defendants, those manufacturers are going to say, look, you're a firefighter, probably rolled in foam. You were in fires with all types of chemicals, and you're going to blame your jacket and your boots for causing your cancer. Again, it's specific causation is the defense in these cases, the best one for them, except for the cleanup side. Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, the one thing I was just going to add, I mean, I totally agree with Hunter on his insights into how the defendants are thinking, but I think they felt better a little over a year ago because they put a lot of eggs in one basket as far as the government contractor defense. They came into this MDL and essentially told the MDL judge, the message was this is going to take care of this litigation, and what that is the AFFF that was used by the military was governed by military specifications. And under certain circumstances where that's the case, the contractor that makes the manufacturer that would make AFFF would be immune from liability. Well, we spent, I mean, that was really a big focus of the early years of this MDL was teeing up that issue. We took depositions, we briefed it. It was a motion for summary judgment, and the court denied it. Now, that does not mean that they can't raise that defense at trial, but it took a huge arrow out of their quiver, I think, as far as their defense and how they planned, how they sort of envisioned this MDL going. So that was a pivotal, I think, decision, pivotal, time. At least in the AFFF MDL, when the court denied that motion. I think it was September last year.
Thank you for that. I just had two more questions. I want to be respectful for everybody's time. One is, from what you're seeing after intake, following up with blood tests to sort of put everything together, what kind of fallout are you seeing once the results come back? And did you get that far yet?
With the blood testing?
Nick.
Yeah, let's leave it. That's a Nick one.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we have done a lot of testing, but we still don't have such a large sample that it's going to be terribly representative yet. But what we've seen, I was running some numbers today, and our numbers were pretty similar to what is in the studies. We had maybe about 95% of them or more coming in with an appreciable level of one of the PFAS in their blood. And, the levels or some are low and some are high, but, within kind of what we're seeing in general studies.
Okay.
The caveat to that is we're testing people who are plaintiffs or who are prospective plaintiffs. So they're people with injuries, and a lot of them are from those areas where they're more likely to have been exposed. So it's not a representative sample, but of those people we're testing, we're seeing around 95%.
Oh, that's very good. Great. People that want to get into this litigation, how could they contact you to set up, talking about co-counseling with Napoli Skolnick? And also,
I put our firm information there. If you could reach out to Paul Napoli, myself, Andrew, Nick at Napoli Skolnick. I always give my cell phone out. We've got tens of thousands of clients, and I give my cell phone out to everybody. So anyone wants to call me, 917-544-0009. If I don't pick up right away, text me and I'll always call you back. So, and thank you for having us. This has been a real pleasure to spend time with you, except for my spilled coffee.
I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. If you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Paul Liebman at X Social Media. Email is paul@X Social Media. I'll give you my cell as well. It's 631-335-8575. I'll put it in the chat, and I can also make the introduction to Paul or Hunter or anyone else at the firm. And thank you very much for everyone's time. I appreciate it.